Chapter 7 of That Mainwaring Affair. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. That Mainwaring Affair by Maynard Barber. Chapter 7. A Little Royal. "Harry Scott, private secretary of Hugh Mainwaring," announced the coroner, when Mr. Whitney had resumed his chair. As the young secretary walked deliberately through the crowded room, there were few who failed to remark his erect, athletic form, his splendid bearing, and especially the striking beauty of his dark face, with its olive-tint, clear-cut features indicative of firmness and strength, and large, piercing eyes, within whose depths, on the present occasion, seemed to be, half hidden, half revealed, some smouldering fire. Instantly, a half-dozen pencils were transferring to paper his form and features. "Say, what are you doing him for?" whispered one reporter to his neighbor. "He isn't anybody, only the old man's secretary." "Can't help that," replied the other. "He's better looking than the English chap, anyhow, and, in my opinion, the old fellow would have shown better sense to have left him the stuff." Meanwhile, young Scott, having answered a few preliminary interrogatories, turned slowly, facing Mrs. LaGrange, who was watching him with an intensity of manner and expression as though she would compel him to meet her gaze. As his glance met hers, a look of inquiry flashed from her eyes to his, accompanied by an expression persuasive, almost appealing. But the only reply was an ominous flash from the dark eyes as, with a gesture of proud disdain, he folded his arms and again faced his interlocutor, while, with eyes gleaming with revenge from under their heavily drooping lids, and lips that curled from time to time in a smile of bitter malignity, she watched him, listening eagerly for his testimony, losing no word that he said. The young secretary well understood the character of the enemy with whom he had thus declared war, though he was as yet in ignorance of the weapons she would use against him. But the honeyed words of the little note crushed within his pocket had no power to swerve him for an instant from the course upon which he had determined. After a few general questions, the coroner said, "Please state when and what was the first intimation received by you of any unusual occurrence." "I was wakened this morning by a woman's scream, and heard sounds of confused running in different directions. A few moments later Mr. Whitney came to my room and informed me of what had occurred, and I then went with him to the private rooms of Mr. Mainwaring." "You were associated with Mr. Mainwaring yesterday, during the greater part of the day and evening, were you not?" "I was during the day, but I did not see him after dinner until late at night." "Did you notice anything unusual in his appearance at any time yesterday?" "He appeared rather depressed for about an hour after luncheon, during the execution of the will." "Did you know any cause for such depression?" "I attributed it, in my own mind, to the conversation at luncheon to which Mr. Whitney has referred." "Regarding one Richard Hobson?" "Yes, sir." "Do you know what, if any, relations existed between Mr. Mainwaring and this Hobson?" The black plumes of Mrs. LaGrange's fan suddenly quivered, her cheek paled, and her breath came and went quickly, but these were the only signs of agitation which she betrayed, as Scott replied, "I have no knowledge as to what relations existed between them of late. I only know that Mr. Mainwaring had, years ago, some important private business with this man." "Will you state the nature of this business?" "Without giving exact details," Scott replied, speaking deliberately but with no hesitation, though conscious of the surprise and indignation depicted on some of the faces about him, "this man was employed as an attorney by Mr. Mainwaring before the latter came to this country, and has since, at various times, extorted money from him by threats of exposure regarding certain transactions." The silence that followed this statement was of itself eloquent. The young secretary felt every eye fastened upon himself, and though his own eyes were fixed on the coroner's face, he saw reflected even there the general expression of mingled astonishment, incredulity, and resentment. Unmoved, however, he awaited, coolly and impassively, the next words of the coroner. "Mr. Scott," said Dr. Westlake, a touch of severity in his tone, "this is a serious assertion to make regarding a man so widely known as Mr. Mainwaring, and so universally considered above reproach in his business transactions." "I am aware of that fact, sir," replied Scott calmly, "but reference to the private letter files of Mr. Mainwaring will prove the truth of my assertion. I made this statement simply because the time and place demanded it. You were endeavoring to ascertain the cause of Mr. Mainwaring's perturbation on learning yesterday of the arrival of Hobson. I have given what I consider the clue." "How recently had this man Hobson extorted money from Mr. Mainwaring, and in what amount?" "The last money sent him was about 3 years ago, a sum of $5,000. Hobson wrote a most insolent letter of acknowledgment, stating that, as this money would set him on his feet for a time, he would not write again immediately, but assuring Mr. Mainwaring that he would never be able to elude him, as the writer would keep posted regarding his whereabouts and might, some time in the future, call upon him in person. Can you describe this man's appearance? I cannot, having never met him. Will you describe the stranger who is reported to have called in the afternoon? He was tall, quite pale, with dark hair and mustache. He was dressed in a tweed suit, somewhat travel-worn, and wore dark glasses. Did he state his errand? Only that he wished to see Mr. Mainwaring on business of special importance. He at first seemed rather insistent, but on learning that Mr. Mainwaring was out and that he would receive no business calls for a day or two, he readily consented to defer his interview until later. Did he leave his name or address? His card bore the name of J. Henry Carruthers, of London. He gave his present address as the Arlington House. You noticed nothing unusual in his appearance? The only thing that struck me as rather peculiar was that Mr. Carruthers seemed well informed regarding events expected to take place here, while his name was wholly unfamiliar to Mr. Mainwaring. At this point a penciled note was handed by the coroner to Mr. Whitney, who immediately summoned George Hardy and hastily dispatched him on some errand. Mr. Scott, resumed the coroner, were you in Mr. Mainwaring's private library at any time during last evening? I was not. I spent the entire evening in my own room. When did you again see Mr. Mainwaring? Not until after 11 o'clock. I had come down for a smoke in the grounds outside, and met Mr. Mainwaring in the lower hall on the way to his rooms. He asked me to come to his library before retiring, as he wished to give some final directions for the next day. About half an hour later I went to the library door, but hearing loud and angry talk within, I waited in the hall some 15 or 20 minutes, until I knew Mr. Mainwaring was alone. I then entered, received his instructions, and went directly to my room for the night. Were you able to recognize the voices or hear any of the conversation? I was. I recognized the voice of the housekeeper, Mrs. LaGrange, but feeling that I was hearing what was not intended for me, I walked back into the main hall and remained there until Mrs. LaGrange came out. You saw her leave the library? Yes, sir. I passed her in the corridor. She saw you, of course? She seemed scarcely conscious of my presence until we had passed. She then turned and watched me as I entered the library. What was the nature of the conversation which you heard? I only heard what Mrs. LaGrange said. She evidently was very angry with Mr. Mainwaring. Can you repeat her words as you heard them? Not entirely. She accused Mr. Mainwaring of dishonesty, saying that he had defrauded his only brother, and had ignored and robbed his own son to put a stranger in his place. The last words I heard were, "You are in my power, and you know it only too well, and I will make you and your high-born, purse-proud family rue this day's work." Harry Scott, with the proof of his employer's crimes in his possession, repeated these words with an indifference and impassiveness that seemed unnatural, while the smoldering fire in his eyes gleamed fitfully, as though he knew some secret of which the others little dreamed. But if spoken indifferently, the words were not received with indifference. The reporters bent to their task with renewed ardor, since it promised developments so rich and racy. Ralph Mainwaring's face was dark with suppressed wrath. Mr. Thornton seemed hardly able to restrain himself, while the attorney grew pale with excitement and anger. Mrs. LaGrange alone remained unmoved, as much so as the witness himself, her eyes half closed and a cynical smile playing about her lips as she listened to the repetition of her own words. Did Mr. Mainwaring make no reply? Inquired the coroner. He did, but it was inaudible to me. You went into the library as soon as he was alone? I did. At what hour was this? A few minutes past 12. Was that the last time you saw Mr. Mainwaring living? It was. Can you state whether anyone was in his rooms after you left? I cannot. Mr. Scott, by your own statement, you must have been in Mr. Mainwaring's library within an hour preceding his death. Consequently, I would like you to give every detail of that interview. I am perfectly willing, sir, but there are few to give. The interview occupied possibly 10 minutes. Mr. Mainwaring appeared very weary, and after giving directions regarding any personal mail or telegrams which might be received, stated that he wished me to consider myself his guest on the following day and join in the festivities of the occasion. I thanked him, and wishing him good night, withdrew. In which room were you? We were both in the library. When I first entered, Mr. Mainwaring was walking back and forth, his hands folded behind him, as was usually his habit when thinking deeply, but he immediately seated himself and gave me my instructions. The tower room was dimly lighted, and the curtains were drawn quite